This is the Iron Will Report for the week ending May 31st. In this week's report, is the WHO pandemic treaty dead? The bill Justin can't pay, a simple method to cure screen addiction in kids, a special report on how they cooked the COVID numbers, and our first viewer survey. Those and 9 more stories that mainstream media won't report, and our government doesn't want you to hear. Last week at the 77th World Health Assembly, the WHO was hoping to present 2 totalitarian governance instruments for adoption. One is the Pandemic Treaty, also referred to as the Pandemic Accord, and the other is the amendments to the International Health Regulations. However, this didn't happen due to an inability of member countries to agree on the text of the agreements. We'd like to believe objections were raised by member countries over the totalitarian nature of the accord and the amendments, but as WHO watchdog James Roguski revealed in a recent interview I did with him in March, the objections have largely been raised by poor countries upset that they weren't being given a fair share of the economic benefits enjoyed by more affluent countries. But does this mean the treaty is dead, as many are claiming? Certainly, Dr. Meryl Nass, an expert on biowarfare and founder of Door to Freedom, an anti-WHO governance organization, thinks so. Nothing in the Pandemic Accord can rise from the ashes of the negotiations to be voted on this week. The treaty is done. People now understand what it was about, what was in it, and how it was the first step to a one-world government. They've said no to all that. Dr. Nass characterized the news as a first-round win in the war of democracy versus one-world government. There is one exception, Nass said. Referring to Article 5 of the IHR amendments, she noted that the negotiators were fine telling nations to surveil their citizens and combat misinformation and disinformation. However, she continued, nearly all governments are already surveilling and propagandizing us, so while this provision is odious, it really doesn't change anything. She also noted that while consensus was reached on Article 18, the implementation of health passports and other similar documents during a health emergency, this is now a recommendation instead of a requirement. Definite language, such as the word shall, has been removed from the text. However, while this is definitely a victory for freedom and a large setback for the globalist control agenda, they're not simply going to give up. Dutch attorney Mieke Terhorst said, according to my information, if the pandemic agreement fails, then they can continue negotiations later this year with the view of trying again at next year's World Health Assembly. The next step may be that they take the agreements to the UN General Assembly in September in New York to elicit a broader discussion and look for ways to rewrite the accord and amendments to get them passed next year. And remember, too, that the objections raised by non-consenting countries were not due to giving up sovereign control, but rather not getting enough money out of the deal. Tyrants never just give up and go away. They have to be stopped. We should celebrate this victory. It has, at the very least, bought us time. But the war is not yet over. You can also see my recent interview with Dr. Nass at ironwillreport.com. Several economists have forewarned that Canada's poor economic growth is far from over. However, a new report is suggesting it may be here to stay for the next 2 decades. Canadian financial firm Omnigence published a study that forecasts Canada is moving towards a protracted bout of stagflation that will drive the country into even higher inflation and continued low growth. Canada will likely see the lowest real growth of any country in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, over the next 3 years, without factoring in the country's population growth. Among the many concerning economic indicators cited in the report is productivity, a major precursor to an economic growth and an area in which Canada has consistently fallen behind the U.S. over that same period. In addition, Canada continues to lose capital, with more money leaving the country on an annual basis than coming in, as wealthy individuals and corporations flee our punitive tax environment. Canada is not only losing in areas of capital and productivity, however, it's also experiencing a housing shortage, currently short of 3 million houses needed, without a concrete resolution on the horizon. Housing shortages naturally contribute to inflation, which diverts necessary capital away from more productive activities. Canadians also have to face the challenges of the Trudeau government's 2050 net zero targets, which demand enormous amounts of capital while increasing the cost of energy. What this all adds up to is this chart, showing Canada having the lowest projected GDP per capita of all 38 OECD nations. The study suggests that investors put their money into lower-cost food chains and automotive maintenance and farmland, as these sectors will likely be the beneficiaries of long-term stagflation. Canada's underfunded and understaffed military continues to be an embarrassment. U.S. Ambassador to Canada David Cohen says Canada may soon become the only NATO member failing to meet the minimum defense spending requirement of 2%, a target that has been in place since 2006. Mr. Cohen's remarks come 2 days after a bipartisan group of 23 U.S. senators wrote a letter urging Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to meet Canada's NATO spending obligations. Under Canada's new defense policy, the federal government estimates its defense spending will rise to 1.76% of the country's gross domestic product by 2030. The 1.76% of GDP translates into nearly $8 billion in spending over the next 5 years, said Defense Minister Bill Blair, who outlined plans for the increase in funding for the Canadian Armed Forces in Canada's recent defense policy update. Canada currently spends just shy of 1.4% of its GDP on the military. Canada recommitted to reaching the spending target at NATO's annual meeting last summer in Lithuania, agreeing that 2% should be the base requirement for all 31 member countries by the end of 2024. However, U.S. Ambassador to NATO Julianne Smith stated this year that she has seen no indication that Canada has a plan to meet the 2% target, despite claims from the Canadian government. Historically, Canada has been a NATO laggard in terms of its percentage of GDP spent on defense, consistently failing to meet the 2% target agreed upon by NATO members since 2006. Last year, Campaign Life Coalition announced the first Pride Flag Day school walkout. Students across the country stayed home that day to protest the LGBT indoctrination of our kids in schools. The walkout last year occurred on June 1st, as June is officially Pride Month. Campaign Life had hoped for a 10% absence rate. Instead, rates varied from 30 to 75% across the country, with classrooms so empty that even mainstream media couldn't ignore it. June 1st is once again Pride Flag Day. However, this year, June 1st falls on a Saturday. Jeff Gunnarsson, National President of Campaign Life, recommends that you contact your school to see if the plan to raise the flag on Monday, June 3rd. If so, keep your kids at home that day. Let's keep sending the message that we won't stand for our kids being indoctrinated with a minority agenda. Recently, the federal policy advisory body, Policy Horizons Canada, polled Canadians on a list of threats to Canada to find out which were of highest concern and which would be most devastating if they happened. But Policy Horizons, after supposedly speaking with experts on each of the possible threats, then, quote, gathered and analyzed input from around 500 stakeholders, colleagues, and foresight experts across the Government of Canada and beyond. So they asked government employees? Here's a thought. Let's find out what conservative Canadians think. I'm announcing our very first viewer poll at ironwillreport.com. By the time you watch this, I will have posted to ironwillreport.com the same 35 potential disruptions on the horizon polled by the government. The poll will be completely free and should only take a few minutes to complete. Once we get the results, I'll report on them, both ours and theirs. That is all for this week's free version of the Iron Will Report. If you want to help us spread the truth, please subscribe to our channel and like and share this video. Social media algorithms promote content based upon how many followers, likes, and shares they get, so please take just a few seconds to do that and help us share the truth with others. You can also get a full access 15-day free trial at ironwillreport.com without providing your credit card information. It only takes a minute, and you will be granted instant access. See what you're missing, no cost and no obligation. Many of the stories I report on would get me banned on some social media platforms, which is why they're only available at ironwillreport.com. In this week's members' version of the Iron Will Report, an independent journalist exposes collusion between mainstream media and politicians, a simple, effective method to cure kids of screen addiction, the non-study study that confirms why grocery prices are skyrocketing, finally, definitive numbers on the percentage of vaccine recipients who suffer severe reactions. And it's much higher than you think. A special report on how they cooked the COVID numbers. 2 new studies showing the increase in all-cause mortality that started in 2021. Who's funding gain-of-function research on the H5N1 virus? An Ontario police officer is on trial for investigating the truth, and North Korea's poop war against South Korea. In interviews coming out this week, on Sunday, what the WHO's proposed healthcare dictatorship would look like. BC surgeon Ben Turner discusses the outcome of a recent Supreme Court case which upheld the province's violations of the rights of healthcare workers. While the WHO is losing ground, the healthcare dictatorship in Canada is alive and well. Then on Wednesday, Dr. Robert Malone, best-selling author of Lies My Government Told Me, on psychological biowarfare. Who is really behind the global fear-mongering psyops? What does the globalist corporate structure look like? And how afraid should we be of H5N1, the next Disease X boogeyman? And finally, I invite you to participate in our very first viewer survey on the top 10 threats to Canada. Let's find out what Conservatives think and how the results will differ from the government employees asked by Policy Horizons Canada. You can take the survey at ironwillreport.com. You do not need to be a member.